The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. We're on location today at the 1991 Minnesota State Fair. Our guest, Senator Paul Wellstone, who'll be talking with me about some issues affecting children and families today. Senator Wellstone, we're here at the State Fair. It's Children's Day, and we're here to talk about children's issues. I know during your campaign and since you've been elected, you've been a strong advocate for children and families. What kind of special legislation are you working on right now that's going to improve the often desperate situation of children and families in Minnesota and in the country?
You know, Gretchen, it's almost hard to know where to start, because I really think that when historians look back in this last decade, part of the indictment of what we've done is the extent to which we've abandoned children. And we've also devalued the work of adults who serve children. And so there's much to change. I have spent a lot of time advocating full funding for the Women, Infant, and Children program. And the reason for that is it seems to me that unless expectant mother woman has a diet rich in vitamin, mineral, and protein, that her child to be is at birth not going to have the same chance. So I think that's a really important children's program, educational program. We're pushing hard. I am for full funding of Head Start. We've talked a lot about much more of a commitment to affordable developmental child care. I mean, it's such a big issue, not just for low-income citizens, but really reaching well into the middle-income level. My wife, Sheila, especially, is on fire about just the whole horrifying issue of domestic violence against women and children, which is an area that people, Gretchen, are just starting to look into, especially thinking about preventative measures. How does this happen? How can we explain this violence, including against children, which is a story that hasn't been told. At the higher education level, I'm especially interested in reintroducing legislation after Labor Day in the non-traditional students that go back to school. When I was in college, I would think of a student as being 20 and living in a dorm. That's not the typical student any longer. Quite often, your typical student is older, often a single parent with small children. And so there's a whole question, again, of where there will be child care support. So across the board, there's a lot to do. And the other issue that I've got to mention to you, because it affects the lives of children and it affects the lives, really, of all of us, is I'm sure that we have to move toward a system of affordable, dignified, humane health care in this country. We're going to have a national health care program.
I think that is one of the key questions, and could you expand on that a little bit more? Some of the local health care officials have told me that not only is there a desperate need for a national health care, but especially in terms of children, it has to focus on prevention rather than just treatment.
Yeah, well, I think that if we provide more public dollars, but we don't insist on a restructuring, we'll be making a big mistake. And clearly, much more has to be done on the front end by way of preventative medicine than has been done. You can have, but we don't yet in our country, have a wonderful system of primary care out there in the community, provided for men and women and their children, backed up by specialization. Right now, I think we've got a little bit in reverse. There are a number of different bills. We're going to markup. I was lucky that I was able to get on the Labor and Human Resources Committee, which in the Senate is the committee that healthcare legislation emanates from. Also, interestingly enough, I'm on the subcommittee on families and children and the subcommittee on education. So I'm right where I need to be. My own view is that we should move toward again, a national health insurance program, but I'm real worried. I mean, we should have real honesty in this interview that with the gridlock that there is in Washington, that we'll talk about it and it won't happen, you know?
The rhetoric about children and children's issues and not putting the bucks behind it.
Well, I mean, every politician loves children. It's become the equivalent of kissing babies, except when it comes to the budgets. And my feeling on health care, and then I'll move to a more general point, is that I think, and introduce a bill again after Labor Day, a woman named Roberta Walberg from Minnesota has been working hard on this, and I think it's a good piece where we're going to essentially say federal government provide some waivers to states so they can get away from some of the rules and regulations and some incentives and let states move forward with their own universal health care coverage program. I'd really like to see that the direction we go in. Let's set up some demonstration models. Minnesota, I know, would do it. We're ready to. And let's see what works. So if we're going to have big debate on whether we'll have an overall national program, at least let some states move forward. I think we may have to proceed that way. In general, what I would say about children's budget is, and children's defense budget does as well as any public interest organization in making this point, the rhetoric's there, it's not matched by resources, and we probably will never have a real strong country or real national security until we invest in the skills and health, intellect, character of our young people. We haven't done that yet, and we need to.
But it must be so frustrating for you because you don't believe in this sort of rhetoric. But how do we really get around to making children a national priority rather than just a token?
It is frustrating for me because I co-sponsored a piece of legislation with Chris Dodd, who really cares a lot about this, chairs the subcommittee on families and children, and we had a couple of people come in who are renowned pediatricians saying this is the most important piece of legislation in the country, but there really was no big coverage of it, and everybody knows it won't be funded now because we don't have any money because of this budget agreement. And I guess that can't give you the best answer, because when will the time come? I mean, I could say the time has come for a commitment to our children, for a children's agenda, but when will the time come? I think the time will come when those of us in leadership positions are willing to just fight like hell and to be really outspoken and to say it's an outrage that we're not doing what we should do, and when people at the grassroots level send those letters in, make those phone calls. You know what I think, Gretchen? You know what I think would be best of all? Here's a dream I have. I would like to see people in every congressional district, all right, 435, and in every state, okay, 2 senators from each state, have one day a year where everyone is called, all of us are called back from Washington for accountability sessions, and people say, these are the key issues, and we want to know how you're going to vote. That's what needs to happen.
That would be a little scary, I think, for some elected officials.
It would be, because I think the vast majority of the people are very much committed to doing much better than we have. You know, there's a lot of goodness in people. People aren't comfortable with knowing that 1 out of every 5 children are poor, or 1 out of every 2 kids of color are poor, the number of kids that drop out from school, and number of kids that are homeless. People aren't comfortable with that. Not even vaccinated. You know, we now have to worry about the rise of measles because that tells us something when our children aren't properly immunized.
That brings up an interesting question. What do you do for that individual child or family that aren't part of an organized lobbying bloc? Children's Defense Fund and other organizations really define the problem clearly, but having an open day where anyone can come and tell you this is what's up with my family, how do you make sure that you're getting the needs of those constituents who aren't part of a larger lobbying group?
Well, you put your finger on a problem, although for me it's been sort of a different problem. My problem has not been that it's been, you know, I've had trouble kind of hearing from people who are really going through these struggles. It's frightening, the caseload that we have. And what's happened is I hear from people in Minnesota who, you know, will write their senator anyway or call, but I'm hearing from all the people low and moderate income who before haven't done that, and I hear every day about children. The bigger problem, which I think you were really alluding to, is that kids in general don't have the Children's Defense Fund has limited. Children don't have a strong voice. They don't have the ability to hire lobbyists. They don't have the ability to themselves march on Washington. You know, this is maybe off the topic, maybe isn't. I'm giving some serious consideration to this idea that we should lower the voting age to 16, not 12. I don't think that made sense. But I've been thinking about it, because if you think about it now, we're not talking about children, early years, but 16, those young
They're old enough to drive. They are responsible.
They're old enough to drive. They're old enough to work. They're old enough to be taxed. And they're old enough to know that they might not even be able to afford higher education right now. They're old enough to know that they might not be living in a more beautiful and healthy world because the environment is being destroyed. And they're old enough to know that the job market is very bleak. And I've been giving some real consideration to that. I also think, I want you to know this because it's personal, but I want, since you said, how do you stay aware of this? There's probably not a weekend that passes during the school year where I don't try and come on a Friday or a Monday and spend time somewhere in a school, and it's almost always either children or preschool. And the one thing that I will never, never, never lose my indignation about is when I meet a child that's 7 or 8 who's already given up. I know that the circumstances of that child at home are so awful, that child's life is so awful. That child doesn't view himself or herself as someone who will be successful. And that, to me, is a waste of people. It's the worst thing we could ever do to an individual.
It's a frightening situation in Minnesota, and I think many of us aren't really aware. A colleague of mine at the library is working on a project with homeless teenagers, and seeing some of the video footage from interviews with those young people, the desperation, the total lack of trust, and the sense that there are no adults who really are going to help them. And these are articulate young people, and when you talked about teenagers voting, I think those young people would be able to say, the system isn't working for me.
I think so. I see those kids. I will drop in. I don't take media with me because it's not fair to the people, but I will drop in at places, and meet with people in shelters and whatnot. And there is a lot of potential, as you said, that's there, Gretchen, but I don't.
But children sometimes are hidden, and such a sense of failure that these things that we have not been able to make things better for young people today.
I said yesterday I was in Winona and I was at the hospital there. It's a really fine community hospital, and I at the very end was in obstetrics, and I said, oh, I love it here. And there was this one little baby, big guy, almost 12 pounds. And I said to the nurses that were there, and I think the hospital administrator was with me too, Roger Metz, I said, I look at that child, and I would like to be able to go in a hospital and see these infants and know that whether the infant was white or black or came from a family with a high income or low income or rural or urban, that each one of those infants would have the same chance. But they don't. You look at them at that age and you say every one of them should be able to be all they can be.
Certainly. Or just the high birth weight. It's another problem with many children at poverty level. Do you see, well, obviously there is a growing disparity between families that have jobs and money, families that don't. What about families in rural areas, the delivery of services? You must hear from your constituents about the difficulty out there.
Well, in the rural areas, in the urban areas, what happens is that people who don't have access to health insurance or health care use the emergency room as their family doctor. In the rural areas, it's a somewhat different issue, which is now many people in our rural communities not only are concerned about how to pay a doctor's bill, but how to even find a doctor, because a lot of doctors are leaving, those smaller hospitals are closing. So it's an issue, that goes across the board for children, adults, low income, moderate income. We have done a very poor job of supporting the delivery of health care in our rural communities, and it starts at the medical school level, and there are men and women who would like to practice such medicine, but they have these huge debts, and they can't make enough by way of fees to cover the schedule of paying the debt off. So there has to be debt forgiveness, there has to be special programs and incentives. It's not there.
Well, you've talked a little bit about the problem of kids in higher education. Are you going to do something to make a college education a little bit more affordable within the reach of more kids?
I always kind of try and make one promise and not another promise. I am going to be a real strong voice and really fight hard for full expansion of Pell Grant program, not going under 10,000, but well into middle income range, for expansion of low interest loans, for expansion of support for non-traditional students, for doing something about a ridiculous asset test. If you come from a farm, it's counted as income, and you're really not eligible for any kind of grant assistance. You bet. I mean, we turned it all around in the 80s. We went from 75% grant, 25% loan to just the opposite. I've met these students who they sell plasma at the beginning of the semester to buy textbooks. They work 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs. This is crazy in terms of what our future is. So yeah, the promise is that I will really push hard and fight hard. I'm a fighter for people. Will it pass? Will this legislation pass, given the sort of political climate right now? I don't know. I just think we have to keep pushing hard for it. I know the urgency of it.
What happens when you're faced with the needs of early childhood, the needs of elementary school? You've got the healthcare people lobbying. You've got all these different groups trying to get a piece of a diminishing pie. Do you have any ideas on how we as a society could better serve the whole child, meeting the social, the educational, the healthcare needs of...
Well, first of all, what I don't want to do is, I don't really think that it makes sense to play off children versus more money for the environment, or there'll be money for energy, not for education, or there'll be money for investment in businesses, but not for kids. I think that at this point in time, there are 2 propositions to the budget agreement that have to be challenged, Gretchen, if we're actually going to do anything. And one of them is that we should spend $300 billion on a military budget. We don't need to spend $9 billion defending Japan. Lots changed since 1947. We can defend our own children. We don't need to be spending, look at what happened yesterday, $150 billion preparing for a war against the Warsaw Pact in Western Europe. That's not the world we live in. We should be defending our own children. And if we have to raise revenue to pay off the debt, which is not so healthy for our kids either, what we're handing down to them, and invest in some of these areas now as opposed to rhetoric, then we should raise the money. We should raise the taxes. We should do it fairly.
You're a brave man to say that right here at the State Fair.
It's true.
Got some,
I don't mean it's true. I'm a brave man. Thank you for saying that. I mean, I think it's just absolutely true. It's like there's an old Yiddish proverb: you can't dance at 2 weddings at the same time, and you can't be saying we should do this and we should do that
without some means to provide for it.
Talk about where it comes from. Yeah.
Jobs, loss of jobs, of course, is something that's affecting families now. Are you getting reports from your constituents about the economic situation in Minnesota, job loss, that sort of thing?
More than job loss is the number of people that are subemployed, can only work part-time, that aren't counted as unemployed, and the number of people that are working in jobs, a lot of younger people, under 40 hours, wages of $5.50 with no health care benefits. So I think it's a much bigger problem than the officially defined unemployment. I think the real problem is subemployment. In other words, unemployment, part-time workers, because that's all they can get, and people who are working, but they just can't even begin to support themselves. It's a huge problem. That's why a lot of kids that go to college now and move back with their parents. They can't afford the housing. It's really, I think, the biggest issue of all. And you can take it from the concrete. I mean, I met a woman here today who came up to me, and she's unemployed, and she wanted to know if I could, do we have a job in the Senate office? I'm sure she's talented. I will meet a lot of people who will talk about this. But this gets to the bigger issue. We have to get our economic act together. I mean, I actually find myself in coalition with a lot of business people on this. I really think that we got to get serious about capital investment. We got to get serious about economic performance. We got to get serious about being able to compete.
Senator, our last question. The role of public libraries in early learning, literacy, education.
The role of public libraries is to make sure, we were talking about children, that every child, when the world with all of its unnamed magic is 4 child has the opportunity to experience that world. None of us can travel the world, Gretchen, but we can experience the world through books. We can experience the world through books and talking to people in the public libraries. We can go to public libraries. It doesn't matter what our income is. It doesn't matter what our background is. And we can let our imagination go, and it will develop our intellect. I mean, libraries to me, my father was a writer. My mother worked in the library. My wife worked in the library in Northfield High School, is a big part of what it means not to throw cold water on the spark of learning, but to ignite that spark of learning. That's how we ignite the spark of learning in young people.
Thank you, Senator.
I have to go on. For me, it's the way I've sampled a lot of the world has been through books, and I want every child to have that same opportunity. ¿Cómo se dice? ¿Cómo se llama? Hey, you guys. You gotta come on our bus up there.
Thank you, Senator Wellstone, especially for those wonderful comments about libraries. And thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency. We thank you for watching, and we hope you visit your public library often.